Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be going over how to extract financial ratios from the data we get from the SEC via their API. So I made a couple of videos before on how to use this API. So if it's your first time watching this, please watch the video on how to use this API. So in this tutorial, I have two scripts. This script will use all the functions I have built and put under this Edgar helper script, and I'll go over those in a bit. But I wanted to show you what the script will do. We're going to source our functions from my other script. So we're going to go ahead and run these two lines. And within our functions list, we have a table called info, which is a table from the SEC with all the tickers. So I'm going to use that table to extract all the symbols and store it into this variable called tickers. So I'll go ahead and run that line. In case there's any duplicates, I only want the unique cases. So I'll go ahead and assign that. Since this ticker list is very large, I'm just going to subset the first three symbols. And as of today, the full list contains over 10,000 tickers. So again, I'm just going to assign the first three. Now I'm going to pass all these tickers as a list into this function. And if we open this up, I'm going to use a function I built in the other script that's going to collect all the values from the SEC filings for the ticker I pass in. So since I only assigned three tickers, let's go ahead and run that. Since this gets returned as a list, I need to row bind all my results. So I'm going to do that by using rbind list and return that as a data frame. So let's run that line. And I'm also going to subset where my ending value is greater than or equal to 2018. So I don't want all the values for all the SEC filings. I just want to focus on the most recent ones. Let's subset our data and we'll take a look at our raw values. All right, so as you see, this table is pretty large, because for the most part it has all the values directly from the SEC filings. So we have a start date and an end date, and that's for the reporting period. If it doesn't have a start date, it's most likely from the balance sheet. We have our value. We also have our filing number, the fiscal year, the fiscal period, what form this value is from, the date it was filed, and some but not all the companies provide this frame, which I believe is the fiscal year, along with the quarter for the company. For all the values, we have a description. As you see, all these are for accounts payable. And then finally, our last column is just the ticker or the symbol. Now, since this table has all of the values, I'm going to try and clean this data up by adjusting these values to quarterly. In some SEC filings, we find that the company aggregates by 9 months or half of the year sometimes. And when I request this data, it'll get returned as such. So we need to modify those values. So I built a function that will do just that. So here in our main script, we want to clean our data for Microsoft, and we need to pass in our raw value table along with the ticker we want to extract data for. So if we run that line, everything will get returned as quarterly. Now finally, I have built a function called get ratios. Again, that function is in the other script, but all we pass in is our clean data, and it will calculate some ratios. So let's go ahead and run that, and we'll take a look at that data frame. All right, so we have a total of 22 columns, and we have our symbol, the date this was ran, our market price, or the last price, and the rest will be ratios. So we have our debt to market cap, our PEG ratio, price to book, price to sales, profit margin, return on equity, our price to earnings ratio, along with the latest trailing 12 months of EPS. Our market cap, we have our assets, liabilities, stockholders' equity, the number of shares outstanding, the trailing 12 months of revenue, the revenue change for the trailing 12 months. We also have our percentage change quarter over quarter. We have our sales per share, our book value per share, our average EPS growth. So by using that function, we will be able to extract all these ratios. So as a warning, I must mention that I did try my best to extract all the tags that were similar across different companies, because not all SEC filings and companies use the same tag. So for example, for revenues, companies may use a different tag or description in their filings. And also for EPS, since we are extracting these directly from the SEC, these may differ from what's online. The ones that are, say, on Yahoo Finance or Seeking Alpha are GAAP adjusted, whereas these are just pulled directly from the SEC and are unadjusted. Now, if you're trying to do this for multiple tickers, I would suggest you download all the values as a batch instead of one by one. And I do have a tutorial on how to download everything as a batch. And what the SEC does is group everything by quarters. So depending on the number of quarters you want to use, you would just download all those batch files, load them up here, clean the data, and then just calculate the ratios. Because if you do it this way, it'll take much longer to run. But if it's just a handful of tickers, you can calculate these ratios, and in the script, we can pass all the tickers that you need as a list into this function. And within this function, we will clean our data and then calculate the ratios. That is, if it doesn't get an error. So let's try and get ratios for all the 3 tickers I have assigned. So I'll go ahead and minimize this. Go ahead and run it. Now I want to skip over any empty lists and then row bind my results. So let's run these 2 lines. We'll take a look at all. And at least for these 3 tickers, we were able to get ratios. All right, so now that you know how this main script works, let's take a look at our function script to see what's going on within each function. So I'm going to go ahead and close these out. We'll take a look at our Edgar helper script. The first thing we need to do is assign our user agent. In order to use this API, we need to insert a domain along with an email address using that domain name, and we're going to assign that into pass. Now our first function is called get raw values. All we need to pass in is the ticker, which will get all the values from the SEC filings by using this other wrapper called get all Edgar. And I have gone over this function in previous videos, so I won't go much into detail on this wrapper. I'll just give a brief overview. Now the next thing in the script is reading in all the company tickers directly from the SEC website, and we will use this table to extract our ticker list and the CIK codes. So if we take a look at this table, we have all of our tickers, the company names, the CIK string, and the formatted CIK string, which essentially is the CIK string with a certain number of zeros at the beginning, since each CIK code has to be 10 digits, and we format those by using our helper functions. So here, after we read in the table, we format our CIK codes by testing whether or not each CIK string is 10 digits. If it's not, then we're just going to go ahead and add zeros at the beginning and insert those as a column within our table. And we need these to be formatted since we will be pulling data from the SEC by using the CIK codes. All right, and then finally just return that table as a data frame. So after it's done reading in and formatting, we have another helper function called getCIK. So if you notice in our main script, we're just passing in the tickers. So what this function will do is subset our CIK codes for the ticker we pass in so that we don't manually have to look up these codes. So we're going to use this function in our getAllEdgar function by passing in the ticker. So it'll look up the CIK code. We're going to get data from the SEC by passing in that CIK code. And if we didn't get any errors, we're going to assign that into raw data. So again, I'll just briefly go over this function because I've used this function in my previous videos. So for each ticker we pass in, it'll test whether these lists exist or not. And if they do, we're going to go ahead and extract everything and return that as a data frame. So here at the very bottom of this function, we're going to rbind fill everything we extracted and return that as a data frame. Now the SEC sometimes doesn't provide all the values. For some reason, I really hope they fix this issue. But one of the most common ones I found was the number of shares outstanding. So if that's the case, we need to scrape this from somewhere else. So we're going to use bar chart to extract the recent number of shares outstanding. So that's what this helper function is designed to do. Now going on to the next function, I saved the table that has the sector and industry for the majority of these tickers. If you would like to have this data incorporated, I have a tutorial that I go into more detail, and this data may be useful if you're comparing companies. You usually want to compare companies within the same sector or industry. So I'm reading that table in, and after I have calculated all my ratios, I usually just add the sector and industry as a column so that I can easily subset companies that belong to the same sector or industry. This next helper function just adds that sector and industry information to our table that contains all the ratios. So here I'm just assigning NAs for major group, division, and industry, and then I'm just using a for loop to subset my sector and industry table and adding these as a column. Next, we have more helper functions that go inside this other function that gets sector and industry data depending on the CIK code. So as you notice, we pass in a ticker. We look up that ticker by CIK code, which will get passed into a URL. And from there, we extract our raw data. And within this data, we are able to use our helper functions to extract the major groups and division, and then returning all the data as a data frame. So essentially, this function was used to generate my RDS file that contains all the sector and industry data. In case there's a new company, I'll go ahead and run this function so that I can continue building on that table. If you're a Patreon member, I'll go ahead and post the table I have generated that contains all the sector and industries for the majority of these tickers. Now moving along to the next function, In case there's an IPO and I don't have the sector or industry data for that particular ticker, I'll go ahead and run this function to get the sector and industry data. And if you notice here, I'm reading in my table and appending it and then resaving it as an RDS file. That is, if we don't get any errors. What I typically do is calculate ratios for several companies. After I generate that table, I add the sector and industry, and then I test whether or not I was able to get the sector and industry for all the companies. If I wasn't able to, then I run this function, and then I rerun add sector and industry a second time, so that this time I add the sector and industry for all the companies that I calculated ratios for, and then by now I should have a more up-to-date table. Alright, our next function is clean Edgar. Now once we have all of our raw values, we're going to pass that table in along with the ticker we want to clean up the values for. So within this function, I'm going to subset our raw value table by the ticker we pass in. I'm going to add a column for the number of months in between the start and end dates for the reporting period. This will let me know if I need any adjusting and if the data is not quarterly. I will then separate my data. So here I'm going to extract all the balance sheet items, which are those that don't have a start date. The rest of the items either belong to the income statement or cash flow statement. Now within this variable, I'm going to extract all the unique tags, which I will pass as a list into this function. And for every tag, I will adjust my data to quarterly data. So first we test whether or not the number of rows is greater than 1. If it is, then I'm going to sort by end date. This will guarantee that all our data is in order. I'm going to find the difference in months. All right, the next thing is to modify and convert these to quarterly data by finding the differences in between the values. So for each of the values we need to fix, I'm going to subset by row, subtract from the previous row, fix the start date to reflect 3 months, also adjust the difference in months, and finally return that data. So after I store everything into sub 1, I'm going to row bind with sub 2, which is the data that we don't need to adjust. Order by end date, and since I'm comparing 2 rows at a time, we need to drop the first row if it's not quarterly. And then finally, once we have adjusted, we're going to store our table into to ret, and that's to return. Otherwise, if there's not enough rows to adjust any data, I will assign sub 1 into to ret. We will either get the adjusted data, but if there's only 1 row and we can't do any adjusting, we're just going to return the data we got from the SEC. So that will be our output. Once we have adjusted our data, we're going to row bind our results, return as a data frame, and reassign ISCF. We will then drop the last column, which contains the month difference, since we won't be needing that anymore. And then finally combine our clean data with our balance sheet data. Once we have that combined, we're going to reorder by end date and return that data. Alright, now our next function is get ratios. So we need to pass in our clean data. We're going to start off by getting the latest quote for the stock by using get quote from QuantMod. We're going to extract the market price or the last price in order for us to calculate these ratios. And we start off by extracting our revenue from the SEC filings. So these are all the tags that I found depending on what industry or sector each company is assigned to. So as I previously mentioned, not all tags for companies are the same. So I'm going to subset our clean data and extract all the cases for revenue. Now for most companies, they'll get assigned to just one of these, but I need to test all so that I don't get any errors. I'm going to remove any duplicate data, and just in case any revenue items are greater than 3 months, I'm going to go ahead and remove those instances. So I only want to focus on quarterly data. Now we can use that table to calculate pertinent info. So I'm going to start off by ordering by file date. I'm going to extract the latest revenue. I'm going to locate the latest filing number, which will be later used. Store our latest revenue into latest rev, and then we can calculate our revenue change quarter over quarter by dividing our latest revenue with the revenue 1 quarter before, and I'm rounding that to 4 decimal places. The next thing I want to do is calculate the latest trailing 12 months of revenue. So I'll be using roll sum on every 4 quarters, and if we extract the last observation, that will get us the latest trailing 12 months. If it's a relatively new company, then we won't have enough data, and if that's the case, we're going to return NA for the latest trailing 12 months. Now to get the trailing 12 months of revenue 1 period before, I'm going to extract the prior row on roll revenue. So that'll get me the trailing 12 months of revenue 1 quarter before. And now I can calculate the revenue change. But if we don't have enough data, then the revenue change will just be 0. Divide the latest trailing 12 months over the prior trailing 12 months and round that to 4 decimal places. And again, if we don't have enough data, then the revenue change will just be 0. Now we go on to cost of goods. So again, we need to extract all the tags. So for the most part, they will fall into one of these. Once we have our subset, we're going to order by end date. Again, extract the latest filing. So for COGS, it may be that companies use a variety of these. So we need to test if many tags are returned. So if the length of COGS is greater than 1, we need to find out which one of these tags is actually the cost of goods sold. So from the tags, you may notice that I have interest expense or non-interest expense. And for some companies, especially if they're financial, then their cost of goods is technically an interest expense. That's the way they have it listed. But interest expense may also be found in companies in different sectors. Since generally cost of goods sold is towards the top of the income statement, this will be a relatively large amount. So I'm testing which one of these tags is greater by using which max. And once I have located which one of these is the greatest, I will subset all the COGS to the real COGS or the real tag. And by passing in my filing number and extracting the value, I'm able to extract the latest cost of goods. So this is just a check on whether or not it returned multiple tags for cost of goods. Now we can calculate our margins. Now that we have that, we're going to extract the number of shares outstanding. So again, we need to subset and locate any of these tags. And if it's not available, we're going to use our helper function by using get shares out and passing in the ticker. In either case, we will get the number of shares outstanding, but we also need to check whether these shares need adjustments or splits. Some companies provide this in the form of a tag, and the tag I found was this one. So if we are able to find this tag, then we do need to adjust the number of shares outstanding. So we're going to return that as a numeric variable and then test whether or not the adjustment is NA. So if it's not an NA, we need to modify our number of shares outstanding with the adjustment. Now that we have the number of shares, we can divide the latest trailing 12 months of revenue by the number of shares outstanding to get sales per share, and divide the market price by sales per share to get the price to sales ratio. If there was an error somewhere, then price to sales will be of 0 length. If that's the case, then I'm going to return NA for price to sales, and this will be an indicator that you need to go back and check the data, because more often than not, the company you're trying to get ratios for may use a different tag. All right, moving along to the next block, we have stockholders' equity. So again, we're going to search for assets and liabilities for the tags, store those as numeric. Now, if the sum of liabilities is equal to 0, or if it's an NA, that just means that liabilities was not listed as a value when we pulled data from the SEC. So since this is an equation, we can easily find out the stockholders' equity by instead searching for stockholders' equity within the tags and then passing that into the equation. So assets minus stockholders' equity will give us our liabilities. But if liabilities and assets were provided, then we just flip the equation around to extract stockholders' equity. Now that we have that, we can calculate our book value per share by dividing the stockholders' equity by the number of shares outstanding and then dividing the market price over our book value per share to get the price to book. Now we can move on to earnings per share. So again, the same process. We need to search for the tags, and if the company provided both basic and diluted, we're just going to extract diluted. We're going to extract our start dates, and then we test whether or not any EPS data was provided. If it wasn't, then we need to go ahead and calculate it. And also, if the data is more than 1 year old, we can calculate EPS, since the data will be not from the most recent quarter. So if we need to calculate it, all we need to do is extract the tags for net income, which are these, and also the number of shares outstanding. Since this is for prior quarters, we can't use the most recent one. So if the data is fairly old, we're going to calculate earnings per share by dividing net income over the number of shares outstanding, by extracting the start dates, getting the last 10 observations for start dates. We're going to pass those in as a list, and then for each of the dates, we're going to reorder by end date. So we're going to compare quarter over quarter and return the earnings per share as a data frame by just extracting the end of the filing period and the actual value. And all these lines are doing are just comparing and extracting the net income with each case of the number of shares outstanding, as this number may change quarter over quarter. So we want to get the most accurate data. Otherwise, if it's a relatively new company, then we only have 1 quarter, so we can't go and iterate through the number of shares outstanding to calculate the differences. So we're going to go ahead and return that same value for that 1 quarter. So it's a pretty lengthy process that we need to follow to come up with the earnings per share. Once we have our trailing 12 months of EPS, we're going to reorder by end date, and we're going to sum the last 4 quarters to get our latest trailing 12 months of EPS. If there's an error somewhere, we can calculate our earnings per share in a different format, and the error will usually arise if there's a discrepancy between the length of the number of shares outstanding where it doesn't line up with the dates for our EPS. So again, pretty lengthy process. We just want to extract the value and the filing end date, and again ordering by the end date, and we're going to sum up the last 4 observations. Otherwise, if there's an error in either case, we're going to return NA for the latest trailing 12 months of EPS. Once we have the latest trailing 12 months of EPS, we can calculate our PE ratio and also our average EPS growth along with the PEG ratio, and then we're going to calculate and store our market cap and the total debt to market cap and the return on equity. Then we need to extract our tag for net income or loss, return that as numeric, and dividing net income by stockholders' equity. Once we have assigned all of our ratios, we can go ahead and combine everything as a data frame, rename some of the column names, and then finally return our financial ratios. So that covers all the functions. And as I previously mentioned, they may not be 100%, but I did try my best to find all the tags for different types of companies, different sectors and industries. So if there's an error somewhere, it will most likely be because of the tags that companies are using. Well, with that, guys, this concludes the video. I'll leave a link down in the description area to my Patreon where you can find both of these scripts. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.